On today's episode, we will be discussing topics such as human remains and stalking. So if you aren't in the headspace for these topics, please be kind to your mind, and I'll see you in the next one. Today, we will be looking at the disturbing case of Debbie Wolfe, a promising young nurse who was working extremely hard in her career until her life was taken from her. Her remains were found at the bottom of a barrel in a pond nearby her house. Police initially investigated her case and ruled it as simply a tragic accident in which she drowned. However, her family and the public believe otherwise, and there is a lot of interesting details in this case that will definitely make you question not only the police, but also the hospital where she worked, because it makes you wonder, is there more that could have been done to prevent her death? Before getting into why most people believe that foul play was involved in her death, let's first begin with learning more about who Debbie was and her life and her life's trajectory before her untimely end. Deborah Ann Wolfe was born on June 19, 1957, in Blytheville, Arkansas. Her father was Jerry Wolfe and her mother was Virginia, and she goes by Jenny. And she had 4 brothers, Jerry, Joseph, John, and John's infant twin, who I'm assuming died at birth because there wasn't much information out there to clarify, but it said John's infant twin. Deborah went by Debbie, so that is how I will refer to her going forward. And Debbie was known as a incredibly intelligent young woman. She was a dedicated nurse, a hard worker, very kind, and people described her as being a very smiley, warm, and happy person. She was making a life for herself, having just graduated from nursing school 2 years prior. And at only 28 years old, she was working at the Fayetteville Veterans Administration Medical Center. She lived alone with her 2 dogs, Mason and Morgan, and she absolutely adored her dogs. And they lived in an isolated cabin just a few miles outside of the city line for Fayetteville, North Carolina. On the outside looking in, everything seemed to be working out for Debbie. And based on how hard she was working, just an amazing work ethic and how dedicated she was to her nursing career, it's likely she would have gone on to do just amazing things. The year was 1985, and she had just celebrated Christmas with her family on December 25th. The following day, she worked a shift at the hospital on the 26th, leaving around 4 p.m. She had a great job, her own place. She was independent, and nothing seemed to be amiss. However, all of that changed when Debbie didn't show up for her next shift at the hospital on December 27th. No call and no show. And this was very troubling considering everyone knew Debbie to be a very punctual and reliable person. This begins the timeline of her case. When Debbie missed her shift, her family and a family friend named Kevin Gorton immediately took action and went to her cabin to look for her. When they arrived, they found her property to be in a state of disarray. Her car was parked in a different spot than usual. There were several beer cans scattered around the property, and her uniform was thrown on the kitchen floor, her purse shoved underneath her bed. And Debbie was a fairly clean person and very organized, and so this really didn't look like her doing. Not to mention, her dogs had not been fed, and Debbie loved her dogs. On top of all of this, they also found a very strange message on Debbie's answering machine. It was recorded earlier that day, and the caller claimed that she had been gone from work for several days. But this was wrong, as Debbie had just worked a shift the day before. Her family also searched the surrounding area and a pond that was in Debbie's backyard. However, no trace of Debbie was found. When her mother tried to report her missing, the police informed her that they would not become involved until 72 hours had passed. And this is likely due to the fact that Debbie is an adult. And this is unfortunately how a lot of investigations take place, where there's a bit of a waiting period before the investigation actually takes place. And what's so unfortunate is that we know that as hours pass, the likelihood of finding someone alive becomes slimmer and slimmer chances. And so, unfortunately, this was also the case for Debbie. On December 31st, 5 days after Debbie went missing, the sheriff's office finally began their investigation. The police investigation began with the police utilizing bloodhounds to trace Debbie's scent, but nothing was found. Investigators did not search the pond that day, so the next day on New Year's Day, Debbie's mother had 2 local divers search the pond. The divers were friends of the family. Kevin Gorton was one, and that was that family friend who went with Debbie's parents to check her property, and then Gordon Childress. Both men had experience with rescue work, and within a few minutes, the divers found 2 sets of footprints and drag marks. These prints led to a horrific discovery. Debbie's body was found in a burn barrel in the pond. Police were brought back to the scene and took Debbie's body from the barrel and from the pond. An autopsy determined that there were no drugs or alcohol in her system, and the cause of death was determined to be drowning. Police investigators believed that Debbie had died accidentally, somehow falling into the pond while playing with her dogs. However, Kevin, the family friend who was involved with the search and rescue, believed that her death was not consistent with drowning. According to him, typical drowning victims would have their eyes and mouths wide open, likely gasping for air, along with their arms and hands stretched out, but Debbie's body was not found in this position. Her body was found in a barrel, and her body was unusually clean despite the dirtiness of the pond. There was definitely some shady police work on this case, and it caused Debbie's family to distrust the police, and rightfully so. First, the investigators took a long time to even begin searching for Debbie, and then they tried to claim that there was no barrel at all found in this pond, and that Kevin and Gordon had simply seen her jacket ballooned out from, being in the water, and they just simply mistook it for a burn barrel. However, Kevin and Gordon claimed that they definitely saw a barrel, and it's pretty bold of the police to even suggest that these divers could possibly mistake a jacket for a barrel. But on top of this, Debbie's mother, Jenny, also claimed that she overheard some of the investigators talking about taking the barrel in for evidence. So how could they possibly take something in for evidence if it just doesn't exist? So either the police were incompetent or they were trying to cover up evidence. Then, prior to Debbie's disappearance, Jenny and several others remembered seeing this barrel next to Debbie's home. And when Jenny went there on December 27th, which was the day that Debbie never showed up for her shift, the barrel was no longer next to the house where it had been, and there was an indentation left on the ground. A few months following the discovery of Debbie's body, Jenny had a chance to examine the clothes found on her daughter's body. Jenny was not convinced that these were her daughter's clothes. The items of clothing were not Debbie's size at all. The pants were too large, the bra cup was at least 3 times too big, and the shoes that she was wearing were also 3 times larger than her normal shoe size. She was also wearing this field jacket that did not belong to her or any of her brothers. But despite the obvious size differences in her clothes, the police maintained that these were actually her clothes. Debbie Wolfe was buried in Arcadia Cemetery in Arcadia, Louisiana, and Debbie would have turned 67 this year on June 19th. Sadly, despite the family believing that Debbie was likely murdered, John, Jenny, and Debbie's brothers, John Jr. and Joseph, have since passed away. That being said, her case is still alive, and many people want answers for why this young nurse, loving daughter and sister, and just all-around beautiful soul was taken at only 28 years old. So let's now look into the theories and potential suspects in Debbie's case. It's pretty obvious to everyone that Debbie didn't accidentally drown in the pond. There's no evidence that she somehow hit her head and drowned, and her body was found in a barrel in the pond. And along with the state of her body, how it was unusually clean, and the fact that these clothes didn't belong to her, it really pointed to someone else being involved in her death. One of the major theories in this case is that someone murdered Debbie, not in the pond, but then placed her in the barrel, then dragged the barrel into the nearby pond. And there's some evidence of this by the drag marks that we see and the footprints, as well as the barrel normally being on the side of Debbie's house and the indentation of the barrel left behind. But who would have done this to Debbie? As far as everyone knew, Debbie was very kind, didn't have any enemies, so was this just the act of some random serial killer? Or was this someone involved in her daily life, someone that she knew? Debbie's mother believed that one of the 2 volunteers from the hospital was responsible for Debbie's death. So Debbie was in charge of the volunteers at the hospital, and 2 of these volunteers actually tried to pursue a romantic relationship with her. However, she wasn't interested, and she declined both of their advances. One of these volunteers really bothered her, as he had a history of psychiatric illness, and from the sources that I pulled from, there wasn't any information about what specific illness he had, but regardless, this man frequently asked her to go out with him and would not relent. And at one point, he was even able to get her home phone number and began to call her. He even claimed to know where she lived and threatened to come see her. After her body was found, he was questioned by the police. However, he had an alibi and refused to take a polygraph test. He left the state a few days later. Debbie's mother believed that this man was likely involved, as he was clearly stalking Debbie, and he also made a threat to her and apparently knew where Debbie lived. The other volunteer, who also tried to be romantically involved with Debbie in the weeks prior to her disappearance, was also definitely showing some stalker behaviors. However, he didn't directly threaten her. Debbie had told him that she wanted to be friends, and many believe that his voice was the suspicious caller on her answering machine. He was also questioned by the police. However, there was no evidence to suspect that he was involved in any way. These 2 men who were stalking Debbie and who were really harassing her because they asked her out while, she's on the job. She declined, and they both continued to pressure her. And sadly, this is not rare for women in the workplace. And gender violence is certainly something that has declined since the 80s. However, it is still commonplace, and it is still something that many women have to deal with. And the story is just so sad and frustrating because decades have passed without really much progress into Debbie's case. And tragically, most of her family members passed away before really knowing the outcome of her case. Her family strongly believed that she was murdered, and I'm inclined to believe that too. There was just so much suspicious activity with these two volunteers at the hospital, and I definitely think that the one who left the state, I don't believe that they should have been allowed to leave the state. I don't know what the jurisdiction was for that, but especially since this happened, the stalking behaviors occurred at Debbie's workplace, you would think that maybe the hospital would have maybe done their own investigation. And it's hard to say whether or not they did or didn't because I wasn't able to find a lot of information on that. But I hope that the hospital learned from this case and kept a better eye on harassment cases, because sadly this type of thing, like I said, happens all the time and doesn't always end as tragic as Debbie's case, but can certainly end that way. And it's very important for people to take stalking and harassment behaviors seriously so that it doesn't escalate to something horrible like this. However, this is all speculative, and at this time, her case is still unresolved, and we don't know what exactly happened to Debbie and if there was an outside person involved in her case. I think most people believe that yes, it was likely either one of these volunteers, or it could have possibly been someone else in Debbie's life that maybe was harassing her or had some sort of vendetta against her. We really don't know. There's also the possibility that it was a random killing, just a serial killer or something of that sort. But regardless of what may or may not happen, I just truly hope that Debbie's case will be resolved one day and that we will finally have justice for her and her loved ones. But with all that being said, thank you for listening. Be well, stay safe, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much for joining me. It's goodbye for now, but I hope to haunt you again soon.